Appeals denied. The High Court won't hear challenges to the redefinition of marriage. A legal expert weighs in. Red Mass. Catholic justices gather for prayer before starting a new term. We look at this annual tradition. Family in focus. Pope Francis encourages humble, frank discussion at a Rome gathering on issues important to families. And hazardous duty. An American photographer arrives in the U.S. after contracting the Ebola virus. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, October 6th, 2014. Good evening from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. The U.S. Supreme Court is refusing to get involved in the national debate over the redefinition of marriage. Today, the High Court turned away appeals from states looking to uphold traditional marriage. Our Wyatt Goolsby is at the Supreme Court tonight with more. Wyatt?
Brian, the decision not to take up appeals from 5 different states this session on the topic of redefining marriage comes as a surprise to many. The justices today did not comment on the issue, so without further explanation, different states right now are having to chart their own path. By not taking action, the Supreme Court has cleared the way for an immediate expansion of so-called same-sex marriage. 5 states were hoping the Supreme Court would resolve the issue of redefining marriage, but today's choice of not hearing the states' appeals means couples in 6 other states could be issued marriage license soon, making a total of 30 states where same-sex couples can marry legally, at least by default. Some advocates for redefining marriage have called it a victory for their side. The president of the Human Rights Campaign saying, quote, "Thanks to the Supreme Court, there is now sweeping guidance in 3 federal appellate circuits that declares marriage discrimination flatly unconstitutional. There is no reason under the sun for federal courts not to fast-track all pending marriage cases in light of today's news." But Kelly Fedoruk with the Alliance for Defending Freedom says it's not that simple.
This issue is far from over. Even though the Supreme Court didn't take this opportunity to review, there are still other circuits that are currently looking at and waiting to rule on marriage definitions.
Fedoruk's group is representing a Virginia county clerk who's advocating for a traditional definition of marriage as written in state law. Ultimately, Fedoruk says the issue should be one the states decide.
States may disagree. They have disagreed on how they're going to define marriage, but the authority should remain with the states and the people of those states to continue this very, very new debate on what marriage is, and a court should continue to affirm people's right to define marriage as one man and one woman.
Already the situation is changing very rapidly. Just this afternoon, the Commonwealth of Virginia began issuing licenses to same-sex couples. Experts had expected the justices to weigh in at least at some point during this session. So at this point, depending on how some of the appellate court cases still working out ultimately end up, the justices here may ultimately, at one point or another, may have to rule once and for all. Brian.
Thanks, Wyatt Goolsby at the Supreme Court. And just as that news broke earlier today, we discussed its implications with a well-respected legal expert. It's good to have Stephen Wermiel with us, a professor of law at American University, author of SCOTUSBlog, or a biweekly column with that blog, and certainly has covered the Supreme Court for many years. The High Court beginning session today with a rather important announcement.
Important, somewhat surprising. The court started its term by telling us that it is not going to hear any of the 7 same-sex marriage appeals that were pending before it. It turned them all down, preferring to wait, apparently, until there is a difference of opinion among the federal appeals courts, which there isn't now.
So what does this mean, then, for the states that have overturned the ban on redefining marriage?
Well, these appeals involved 5 states in which the lower courts and the federal appeals courts had said the states could not ban same-sex marriage. And I presume that those rulings will now take effect, that the state bans will be invalidated pending further word by the Supreme Court.
So this doesn't necessarily mean the High Court will never rule on these cases, just not yet.
Correct. I think there's another appeals court case. This involved 3 appeals courts, all of which agreed that the states could not ban same-sex marriage. There's another appeals court that has already heard arguments that covers Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Michigan. The arguments in that appeals court seem to be less favorable toward same-sex marriage, more supportive of state bans. If that appeals court upholds the state bans and that case gets appealed to the Supreme Court, then we have what's called a split in the appeals courts, which may well be what the Supreme Court is looking for.
Steve, this is a huge decision, or it would be, for the High Court. Do you think that they're holding back intentionally?
I think they are. I think that when the court deals with this kind of remarkable social issue, an issue that has such extraordinary impact on the nation and on societal values, they don't want to do it until they really have to. They don't want to confront it. I think it reminds some justices of Brown versus Board of Education and Roe versus Wade, where there was enormous resistance in the country because the court was perhaps out ahead of public opinion and ahead of the views in many parts of the nation. I think the court wants to wait until it really has to tackle this issue.
This is an unprecedented Supreme Court. Of the 9 justices, 6 are Catholics, 3 Jewish, no Protestants. This has never happened before.
It's never happened before, and it's quite astounding to see how far we've come in a short period of time. I wrote a biography of Justice Brennan, who in the 1950s went on the court, and the most controversial issue in his nomination was his Catholicism. And he was going to be the only member of the court who was Catholic. And the key question they asked him was, is your loyalty to the Pope or to the Constitution? Now it's non-controversial. That issue doesn't really come up. Brennan was the only Catholic for many years. This is quite remarkable.
Do you think the faith of the justices is reflected at all in their decisions?
Well, I don't think it determines their decisions. I think it's hard for them to separate themselves from who they are and what shapes their view of the world. But I don't think it's the dominant thing that decides cases for them.
Well, it should be an interesting session. Certainly got started in an interesting way. Steve Wermiel, we thank you for joining us from American University.
Thank you for having me.
And some of the other cases the High Court will tackle this term include several addressing religious liberty issues. In Arkansas, a prison inmate says he needs to grow a short beard because of his Muslim religious beliefs. Prison officials say this will pose a security risk. A Muslim woman is accusing Abercrombie & Fitch of denying her a job because she regularly wears the headscarf. The retailer says the woman didn't mention religious reasons for that. Another case involves an American born in Jerusalem who wants his birthplace listed as Israel. The U.S. doesn't recognize Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem. Congress has told the State Department to make the change in passports. President Obama and even former President Bush agree that would overrule presidential authority in foreign affairs. Rulings on the cases will likely not be known for several months. A little later on, we'll take you to the annual Red Mass that Catholic justices attend before the new term begins here in Washington. And now some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. A Chicago area man is being charged with trying to travel to Turkey to support Islamic State terrorists. Federal prosecutors say Mohammed Hamza Khan was arrested at O'Hare International Airport Saturday night. He appeared before a judge today who ordered him held until a hearing later this week. The FBI believes about a dozen Americans are already fighting in Syria with ISIS. They say more than 100 have attempted the journey before giving up or facing arrest. The family of an Indiana aid worker held by ISIS is pleading for their son's freedom. Abdul Rahman Kazig, a convert to Islam, was shown in a video Friday as the next possible Islamic State victim. Kazig was working with a relief organization that he helped found when he was kidnapped in Syria last year. Family gathered Sunday to honor Alan Henning, the British aid worker murdered by ISIS. A video showing his beheading was posted by the terror group on Friday. It was the first public appearance by his family after learning about his death. Henning was kidnapped in a 2013 incident while traveling with an aid convoy to refugees in Syria. An American video journalist who caught Ebola in Liberia is in America's heartland tonight for medical care. A plane brought Asho Kuboka to a medical facility in Nebraska today. Mukopa was working as a freelance cameraman when he became ill late last week. His family saw him wheeled into a medical facility after he got off the plane.
You know, he's tentative and frightened, but I think he's strong and his symptoms are not more advanced than when I talked to him before he left, which is a real relief to us.
The patient's father says his son may have caught the virus after helping to clean a vehicle in which someone had died. An Ebola patient is being given an experimental antiviral drug in Dallas. Thomas Duncan was diagnosed with the virus last Tuesday, and he is in serious but stable condition. He had traveled from Liberia to Texas. About 50 people who made contact with him are now being monitored for symptoms. Also today, a nurse in Spain has tested positive for Ebola after caring for a missionary with the disease. The nurse is currently in isolation. If tests confirm the virus, this would be the first time person-to-person transmission of Ebola took place outside of the continent of Africa. Worldwide, that outbreak has now claimed more than 3,400 lives. A New Jersey nun is closer to being counted among the communion of saints.
Today, the Universal Church recognizes the holiness of one of our own, right here on native soil.
Sister Miriam Teresa Damjanovic was beatified Saturday in Newark, not far from Bayonne, New Jersey, where she was born. Cardinal Angelo Amato, head of the Vatican Office for the Causes of Saints, presided over the Mass and ceremony. Sister Miriam was only 26 when she died. She was best known for her virtue and mature writings. This was the first beatification ceremony in the U.S. Until a few years ago, they were held exclusively in Rome. An EWTN icon from its earliest years, Father Benedict Groeschel, will be laid to rest on Friday. Father Groeschel passed away Friday evening, the same day St. Francis of Assisi died, just an hour before the feast of St. Francis. Father Benedict helped found the community of Franciscan Friars of the Renewal in the 1980s. He had a significant influence on EWTN, especially in the difficult early years of the network. He'd been slowed by age and infirmity in recent years, but his influence remained strong. Father Benedict Groeschel was 81. His funeral mass will be held at the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Newark, New Jersey on Friday, October 10th, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. The burial will be a private ceremony. Coming up, all 6 Catholic Supreme Court justices honor the annual Red Mass tradition before beginning a new term. And their study of the human brain's inner GPS that could help diagnose Alzheimer's earns a Nobel Prize for Medicine. On Monday evening, October the 6th, thanks for joining us for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. They sit on the bench of the nation's highest court, but do some Supreme Court justices look to a higher power? As Jason Calvi reports, some participate in an annual Catholic tradition before hearing cases.
In Washington, every year before the Supreme Court gavels in for a new term, some attend an annual Mass. 6 of the 9 current justices are Catholic, but the service is open to justices of all religions, like Chief Justice Roberts, Justices Breyer, Kagan, Thomas, Scalia, and Kennedy. The event is called the Red Mass and takes its name from the vestment color, symbolic of the fiery power of the Holy Spirit.
It's very important that we all benefit from the gifts of the Holy Spirit: knowledge, wisdom, counsel, understanding, fortitude. We're handling complex and consequential legal matters every day, and we all welcome and need those gifts.
Elizabeth Mears is a lawyer and president of the John Carroll Society, the group that organizes the event. Just like in the High Court, no video cameras are allowed inside during the service.
Over 1,000 people packed into this cathedral for the Red Mass, named after St. Matthew, the patron of civil servants. And it's actually right here that the body of Catholic President JFK laid during his Requiem Mass.
While living, President Kennedy attended the Red Mass. The first one was held here in 1953.
Red Mass goes back to Rome and London and Paris centuries ago. It began at the beginning of the judicial year of the Sacred Roman Rota, the tribunal of the Holy See.
Here in Washington, the Red Mass is celebrated every year on the Sunday before the court's opening. And while the justices get a lot of the attention, the service is meant for all lawyers and public officials.
We pray for the ability to discern the right path.
Cardinal Donald Wuerl wrote the homily read by the chaplain of the Carroll Society yesterday.
We also pray for the spirit of understanding, discernment, the sweet gift of the awareness of enlightenment. This is the gift that helps us decide our future steps.
Eternal guidance for the nation's justices as they prepare for new cases. In Washington, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Jason. Pope Francis met with thousands of athletes with disabilities this weekend. The Vatican reports the Pope told members of the Italian Paralympic Committee that God is their ally in removing barriers to sports. An armless Italian dancer performed for the Pope in Paul VI Hall before receiving the Holy Father's blessing. The street leading to St. Peter's Square was transformed into an outdoor gym so athletes could demonstrate their remarkable skills. A scientist with dual U.S.-British citizenship and a husband and wife team from Norway win the Nobel Prize in Medicine. It started in 1971 when John O'Keefe discovered the brain cells that register places. He found that brain cells activate based on a subject's physical location. That lets the brain build a neurological memory map. Then in 2005, husband-wife team Edvard and Maybrit Moser identified a different cell that creates a pathfinding system in the brain. It acts like a GPS. The findings may help with diagnosing and treating Alzheimer's. It appears that poor and middle-income Americans are more generous in their charitable giving than the wealthy. An extensive analysis of IRS data was conducted by the Chronicle of Philanthropy. It shows Americans earning more than $200,000 cut the share of their charitable giving by 4.6% between 2006 and 2012. Those earning less than $100,000 donated about 4.5% more of their income in that same period. The study's authors say the wealthy donors are more oriented towards supporting arts and higher education causes. Lower income donors are more likely to support social service charities. The Chronicle's analysis was based on tax returns filed by Americans who itemize their deductions, including their charitable gifts. Up next, with the encouragement of Pope Francis, the Synod on the Family should spark frank discussion of some hot-button issues. This is the Monday edition of EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us. Protests for democratic reforms in Hong Kong are continuing on a smaller scale tonight. Catherine Elliott reports on the few hundred demonstrators still camping out on the streets.
This was Hong Kong on Monday, and this was the city just a few days earlier. The number of protesters has dwindled significantly, although some demonstrators say they'll stay on the street until the government addresses their concerns. Schools are reopening, civil servants are returning to work, although parts of a main thoroughfare through the heart of the business district remains closed. I respect their rights to express their views, but they also need to respect our rights to return to the office for work, said this civil servant. Tens of thousands of people, many of them students, poured into the streets over the past week to protest China's restriction on the first direct election of Hong Kong's leader, scheduled for 2017. They have also demanded the resignation of Hong Kong's current leader. Police say they've arrested 30 people since the start of the protests. Sunday, a lone man spent hours atop the metal supports of a bridge, threatening to jump because he couldn't go to work and his children couldn't go to school. He later gave himself up to police. Another man made a quick transition from protesting to proposing to his girlfriend, with cheers from the crowd. Government leaders say they will talk with the activists, but it's unclear whether real change to the electoral process is a possibility. Catherine Elliott, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Catherine. And bishops and observers from every corner of the world are now gathered in Rome for the extraordinary Synod on the Family. At the opening session today, Pope Francis asked the Synod participants to be frank and humble with each other. The meetings began with a session on God's plan for marriage and family and another on public acceptance and knowledge of church teaching. Cardinal Donald Wuerl tells EWTN's Rome Bureau it's the beginning of a long and thoughtful discussion process.
This synod is not going to be offering soundbite solutions. It can't. We live in a world that loves quick answers, quick fixes, sound bites that take care of having to think through something.
The Synod includes 2 weeks of large group meetings and smaller working sessions to address global problems in modern family life. This week they'll meet for 4 hours each morning and 3 in the afternoon. Father Paul Sullins is a fellow at the Family Research Council, teaches at Catholic University of America. Father Sullins, how has Pope Francis set the tone for this with his comments over the weekend?
Well, he used the image of the vineyard in the gospel yesterday to set a pastoral tone for the Synod, saying this is going to be trying to take care of God's dream of family life, just like the vineyard was his dream for Israel. And the word pastoral is really important here, I think, because it's the image of a shepherd taking care of his sheep. And the Church recognizes that even though theologically we are saved in our unique personal selfhood before God, kind of individually, that sociologically we come to God in groups. Sheep are not cared for as individuals, but as flocks. And the faithful are not cared for by the Church as individuals, but as members of family, first and foremost.
You are a sociologist, and I wonder, in thinking of it in that context, the Pope has instructed the bishops that listening here really is the key, listening to the people, the key to the Church being able to spread Church teaching with credibility. What do you think he means by that from how you see it?
You know, the last part of the name of the Synod is the Synod on the Family in the context of evangelization. And that reflects a recognition that it is the family that socializes us into the faith. Children grow up learning to give and take with their siblings, learning to obey their parents, learning to receive and to give love in a family, and then they're able, on that basis, to learn to receive and to the love of God. So when families are hurting all around the world and in decline and in trouble, then the faith also begins to suffer.
So there's been a lot of discussion about the Church's views on divorce and remarriage and communion. Our Rome Bureau talked with one cardinal who had a different take on it. Listen.
The use of the word pastoral is very crucial. And the pastoral work of the Church, I think, is very nicely described as the Church as a mother. So how do we accompany people? And I think that's a strong theme in the thought and the work and the expressions of Pope Francis.
So in thinking of the Church as a mother, sociologically speaking, how does that help us to get a better handle on this?
You know, Francis used this same image a year ago when he announced the Synod, and said that the Church as a mother needs to learn to act with mercy and kind of nurture and care. And so the hope for the Synod, I think, is not to change any of the teachings of the Church, but to learn how to apply them with more mercy and love and care in the lives of people. If family is so strong in bringing us to the faith, that a positive experience of family life leads people to greater faith. And by the way, that's one of the strongest associations in the social sciences. Children who grow up in strong, intact, married families have higher faith and religious participation throughout their life. But we live in an age where fewer and fewer children experience that. So when the family is in trouble and people then don't have that positive experience of family life, the dream breaks down into single parenthood or into divorce or maybe into avoiding getting married altogether and living in cohabitation. Then what do? How do we respond so as to draw people into the faith, to hold forth this precious, wonderful beauty of the faith, but to do it with mercy and not with judgmentalism?
And when they're suffering in any way, that is when we really need the Church so much. So
absolutely.
It will be an interesting couple of weeks. We thank you for joining us, Father, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us tonight. Until tomorrow, we encourage you to like us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Watch again anytime on EWTN's YouTube page. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thanks for watching tonight. Good night and God bless you.